they lose their own control. They get hand over, and therefore it's
like,
not a creative process.
What I noticed in the race, it's like
yes, quite. That's a gypsy caravan. If you want to sleep there, you can just sleep there as well.
I think they offered it to feed.
Oh, did they?
yes, they're very nice.
The conclusion that we really do not know. We haven't a clue how they do it. And in this state of the utterly unknown, I don't know how they do it either. So I was hoping that by talking about it with Ralph and Terence, it might become clearer, or possibly even more obscure. At any rate, it's something that I really want to discuss with them, and this is the opportunity to do it, and I hope you will all find this of interest too. Because the situation we're in is one of an acknowledged fact. Pigeons can home from huge distances. You can take a pigeon, a homing pigeon, 700 miles from its loft and release it, and it'll be home that evening, if it's a fast-flying bird. Pigeon racing enthusiasts do this regularly, every Saturday, today for example, in the spring and the summer. People are racing pigeons. Sometimes pigeon racing clubs have them released in northern Spain. Sometimes they take them to the north of Scotland. Sometimes they're released in other parts of the continent. Migration of cuckoos. They eat the migration of salmon, eels, and so on. These are usually explained in terms of smell, so the fish runs, which only works really within a few miles of the home river. It doesn't explain how they get thousands of miles of the oceans to work this. So there's a huge number of phenomena to do with migratory and homing senses in animals which are unexplained. And human beings probably have similar powers too. Not very well developed in modern urban people, although even some urban people have quite a good sense of direction. But extremely well developed in nomadic people like Australian Aborigines, South African Bushmen, and also the Polynesian navigators. Now they probably use ordinary senses as well, but this is a whole range of unsolved problems which is hardly touched by science, which leads to the idea that animals, and probably we too, may have senses of smell undreamt of within existing science. So that's the present state of play, and the experiment that I'm proposing is very simple. I can outline it briefly. I think that the evidence suggests there must be some unknown sense, force or power connecting the pigeons to their home. Now what it is I don't know. My image of it is a kind of invisible elastic band. You take them away and it's stretched and they tend to be pulled back, gives them a kind of directional sense. I'm not bothering at the moment about the possible physical basis of this, whether it's part of existing physics, whether it's an extension of non-locality in quantum physics, whether it requires a new field. That question is open. But with this simple model of an invisible connection, the experiment I'm proposing is the converse of those done so far. If the pigeon is connected to its home, then the usual experiment is not taking the pigeon from the home, it comes back. My experiment involves taking the home from the pigeons. This involves the use of a mobile pigeon rod, which is essentially a simple pigeon shell mounted on the farm train on wheels that can be moved around. And I've actually done this experiment, first in Ireland and secondly in Suffolk. So far, I haven't been able to carry it past the first phase, the training phase. I found, however, it's possible to train pigeons to home to the mobile loft. They don't expect their home to move any more than we do. And the first time you take them out of it, you move their home just 100 yards the first time. And when you release them, they can see perfectly well that it's not where it was before. But they go on flying around the place where it was before. It takes them hours before they'll go into the loft and into the position. That's how we'd behave if we went home after being here at Hazelwood and found our home 100 yards down the street. Most of us wouldn't just go straight in and settle down to it. So we'd probably go round and round in circles around the place where it was before and look awfully puzzled. Well, that's what pigeons do. But if you keep doing this, after 3 or 4 times, they just get used to it. They realise there's no manners and nuisance now. And they'll go straight in, they'll find their home up to 2 or 3 miles away within 10 minutes they go straight in.
Yeah. So these home lofts are all in different cities, different streets,
yes,
and so on. So how does it work? The wife of the pigeon racer is at home, and when the mate comes, then pulls out the cellular telephone and calls headquarters.
No, the racing pigeon has a little thing on its leg, a ring for the race, with its number and the race number. They all have those when they're released. When it gets into the loft, it actually enters the loft. The pigeon fancier is waiting there. He captures the bird, takes this ring off its leg. He has a sealed time clock issued by the local Racing Pigeon Federation. He stamps this thing with the time it's come home. And then they all send in these tags with the time that's stamped by these sealed clocks. And they then calculate from the point of release, say it's Wick in Scotland, they then calculate the distance, straight line distance to each of these houses, divide the distance by the time, and they get the average speed.
So there's no account for difficulties and anomalous obstacles encountered along the way.
No, but
feral hawks.
No. Well, if they're killed by a sparrowhawk, they don't win the race.
One more question about the nearest and dearest. Now, the home loft at the racing field, which is still at home.
Yes.
That has family members in it.
Yes.
Just being ready to fight. So first of all, I think we could wish for a homing pigeon or monarch butterfly or something that spoke. Then we could ask them the questions you're posing, and they'd answer. But actually, I wouldn't trust the answer, because this homing pigeon might also have a theory that, like mine, is much too elaborate and unnecessary, when actually there's some simpler explanation, but they don't know it. For example, the Polynesian navigators, if you ask them how they do it, in fact, there was an English navigator who went to the South Pacific and apprenticed himself to a native navigator. You know, they go over 100 miles to the nearest island and get it dead on without compass on cloudy days and so on. So they have a theory that I don't believe it. So we'll just have to make up our own. So this is my fantasy. That, well, first of all, I'm accepting the premise that ordinary fields don't do, so it's a kind of an ESP, and then we want to learn sort of do experiments like propose on the phenomenon to get an idea what it is or how it works, and so this is just a fantasy about that.
Yeah. Would you focus a tiny bit here?
Yes. Well, I don't know. I'll try talking a little louder and see if that helps. So thinking of bats now, which have been studied in a room just like this one with wires just like that. And in the daytime, of course, the bat will fly around missing the wires and not flying into the wall using vision, primarily, we suppose. And then at night, they do the same thing without vision because of sonar. So in this case, there is another field explanation, and it's well established that it's sonar. So I suppose, based on bats, that the brain and the mind are able to image the results of sonar experiments in a kind of image which is the same kind of image that the eyes form. In other words, that instead of hearing, oh, there's a sound over there, they're trying to compute that with echo and so on, that the bat sees the room with its ears in exactly the same representation, three-dimensional visual representation that's dynamic, that it can fly through its own sonar receptions, and that the representations are the same. Then if somebody suddenly turned the lights on, the bat would not hesitate to fall to the ground because it has to switch from system A to system B, that the visual representation of the room would exactly overlay precisely the same image as the sonar image of the room. Similarly, dolphins that have this melon, it's called a huge sensory organ, receives sonar waves, and they form visual type. This is just a speculation. And both in the case of bats and dolphins, the visual representation is three-dimensional, more than ours, which gives them, in a way, a kind of a higher IQ. Then that's a way of seeing. In other words, for bats and dolphins, in the case of dolphins and whales, they can see almost the entire planet as a three-dimensional object with its curvature and so on. So if there were a sixth sense that homing pigeons and monarch butterflies have, and maybe we do too to a degree, then I would suppose that, that it works like that. So after the pigeon is rotated, doped, transported 4,000 miles and released, then with its sixth sense is seeing a very detailed three-dimensional road map of the entire planet, essentially, which is there in this field somehow, just as we consult the road map. First of all, it has to orient the road map, the holographic three-dimensional image of its world, with the visual world when it looks. It has to like sort of rotate things around and get them aligned, and after that first step, it can then fly in the map. And then things like smells, which is smells, the sun, the magnetic field, these things are factors, and they would be kind of labeled on the map by the road association. And so this still doesn't explain how to get home, though, because you have to know where home is marked. Like how many times have you parked your car in a three-level structure and then you come out of the department store after too much shopping, you can't remember where the car is. You know the map of the three-dimensional garage. It has 3 floors, they're square, they're labeled as north, south, east, and west.
Who have been poisoned by language, and that language has inculcated in us the very strong illusion of an unknown future, but that in fact the future is not unknowable if you can decondition yourself from the assumption of spatial concreteness. So the answer to how the pigeon finds its way home is that a portion of the pigeon's mind is already home and never left home. And that we, gazing at this, assume that pigeons, monarch butterflies, so forth, are simpler systems than ourselves. But in fact, our assumption of the unknowability of the future creates a problem here where there is no problem. And that it's only in the domain of language, and perhaps only in the domain of certain languages, that this can become a problem. To put it simply, I assume that if you are a pigeon, we speak here of asking the pigeon, if you had the consciousness of the pigeon, you would not have a diminutive form of human consciousness. You would have a consciousness that we can, obviously, based on this discussion, barely conceive of, because the consciousness of the pigeon is a continual awareness extending from egg to death. And the particular moment in space and time in which an English-speaking person confronts a pigeon is, for the pigeon, not noticeably distinct from all the other serial moments of its life. So the problem is in the way the question is asked and in the way human beings interpret the data that is deployed in front of them. After all, in the animal world, the future is always rather like the past, because novelty is rather suppressed in the animal world. Most things that happen have happened before and will happen again. So my expectation would simply be that what we're seeing when we confront these kinds of edge phenomenon in biology is the beginning of a set of phenomena which, when correctly interpreted, will bring the idea of quantum mechanical biology out of the realm of charge transfer and intercellular and subcellular activity and into the domain of the whole organism. I'm not sure this is the solution, but it does cause the problem to disappear.
Exactly. It's not the solution, but it causes the question to go away. I wish I could say that Rupert
I thought that's what solutions were supposed to
Rupert and I had got together last night and tried to predict what you would say, and I would have bet on that. Still, you exceeded my worst expectations. Are you saying, have I got this right, that the entire life history of the pigeon is more or less determined at the outset, including the trip away from the loft and the trip back? So, as a matter of
It never went anywhere.
it never that's what